In the middle of a brutal snowstorm in the Teton Wilderness, an injured Mustang horse lies frozen in the snow, seemingly on the brink of death. Just when all hope seemed lost, a man named Michael, a lonely rancher, unexpectedly appears. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. In the heart of a brutal winter storm, deep in the Teton Wilderness, a Mustang lies frozen in the snow, barely clinging to life. The wind screams through the mountains, and the thick, swirling snow hides all traces of the wild creature's struggle. He's been abandoned, left to die alone in the frigid cold. But then out of nowhere, a man appears. A stranger to this land, a rancher named Michael, comes across the injured horse, barely able to move, his body bruised and his breath shallow. In that moment, the Mustang, against all odds, raises his head and stares at Michael with eyes full of desperation. With a final heart-wrenching cry, the horse pleads for help. What happens next will shatter everything Michael thought he knew about survival, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between man and horse. The storm raged on as Michael rode through the blinding snow, his horse's hooves crunching through the thick layers of ice that coated the ground. The wind was relentless, biting through his jacket as if it had a mind of its own. Visibility was almost non-existent, and even though he knew the area well, the desolation of the frozen landscape made him feel smaller than ever before. His family's ranch was miles behind him, and he had hoped to get back before the snowstorm hit full force, but now it was clear he wasn't going to make it. As he urged his horse forward, he thought of the warmth of his cabin and the hot meal waiting for him. But something caught his attention in the distance. A dark shape, barely visible in the haze, stood motionless. Curiosity gripped him. He turned his horse in that direction, hoping it was just a tree or a pile of rocks. But as he drew closer, his heart sank. It was a horse, a Mustang, wild and proud, but clearly in distress. The snow around him was stained with blood, and the animal's sides heaved with shallow breaths. Michael dismounted and walked toward the horse slowly, his boots crunching against the frozen earth. The Mustang was lying on the ground, its legs splayed awkwardly beneath him, its eyes, wide and terrified, locked onto Michael's. For a moment, the two stared at each other, man and beast, strangers in the storm. The horse's body trembled from the cold, but it made no move to flee. Michael knelt down beside the animal, feeling his heart race. He'd seen a lot in his years on the ranch, but nothing like this. The Mustang's ribs were visible beneath its matted coat, and he could see the deep cuts along its flanks. The animal had been through hell. "Hey there," Michael said softly, his voice barely audible above the wind. "It's all right. I'm not here to hurt you." He reached out cautiously, his gloved hand brushing against the horse's neck. To his surprise, the Mustang didn't pull away. Instead, it let out a soft whinny, its breath coming in quick bursts. Michael's chest tightened. The animal was too weak to stand, but the sheer strength in its eyes told him that it wasn't ready to give up. The storm was worsening, the snow falling in thick sheets now. Michael knew he couldn't leave the horse here. He had to do something. He was alone, miles from help, and the Mustang was in no condition to survive much longer in this weather. "Hang on," Michael muttered, standing up and surveying the area. There was a small shack nearby, an old hunting cabin he used to visit in his younger days. He had to get the horse there out of the storm, but carrying the Mustang would be nearly impossible. He couldn't risk leaving it alone, but how could he save it? The horse made another sound, a soft, desperate whinny, and Michael's heart clenched. It wasn't asking for much, it was asking for help. Without thinking, he reached into his pack for the emergency rope he kept there. "You're not alone," he whispered, more to himself than the horse. With the storm howling around them, Michael tied the rope gently around the Mustang's chest, securing it as best as he could. The horse's eyes followed him, the pain and exhaustion in them so clear it almost broke Michael's resolve. He tightened the knot and slowly began to pull, leading the Mustang toward the cabin, step by step. The snow was falling heavier now, and every breath Michael took felt like it could be his last. He could barely see through the blizzard, but the urgency in the horse's movements kept him going. As they neared the cabin, Michael's heart pounded. The Mustang stumbled, its legs buckling beneath it. Michael's hands shook as he reached down to steady the animal. "You're gonna make it," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "You have to." The Mustang's head drooped, and for a moment Michael feared it might collapse completely. But then the horse raised its head again, staring at him with eyes filled with something almost like trust. In that moment, Michael understood. This wasn't just about survival. This was about something deeper, something that went beyond the wild instincts of the Mustang and beyond the duty of the rancher. This was a bond forged in the midst of a brutal storm between two beings fighting against the odds. Michael swallowed hard, his breath coming in labored gasps. "I'm not leaving you, buddy. We're in this together." And just as they reached the door of the cabin, the Mustang let out a low, pleading whinny, a sound that sent a shiver down Michael's spine. Something inside Michael snapped, a fierce determination taking over. He wasn't going to let this horse die in the cold. Inside the small cabin, the fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth a stark contrast to the howling blizzard outside. Michael had done everything he could think of to help the Mustang. He had laid down hay to cushion the horse's exhausted body, covered it with blankets, and made sure it was sheltered from the storm. But no matter what he did, the Mustang's breathing remained shallow, and its body trembled with every exhale. Michael sat nearby, his hands still cold despite the fire, watching the horse intently. He could hear the steady thrum of his own heartbeat, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. He'd never expected this, never expected to find a creature in such distress in need of help that only he could give. His mind raced, thinking about the difficulties he faced back at the ranch. His family's business had been struggling for months. The price of feed had skyrocketed, and the crops hadn't been able to hold up to the extreme weather. It was just him and his younger sister now, trying to make ends meet. This wasn't how he had imagined his life, alone in the middle of nowhere, trying to rescue a horse he didn't even know. But he couldn't turn his back. He couldn't leave it to die out there. Michael leaned forward, his fingers brushing the Mustang's mane. The horse's muscles twitched, a sign that it was still conscious, still holding on. He couldn't let the animal go just yet, not while it was still fighting. Minutes passed, then hours. Michael tried everything he could think of to help the Mustang regain its strength. He rubbed the horse's legs, trying to get the blood circulating again. He spoke to it softly, trying to comfort it with his presence. But the Mustang only responded with shallow breaths. It was as if the weight of the world was too much for it to carry. Then, as Michael was preparing to get more supplies from the saddlebag, he heard a faint noise, a soft whinny. His heart skipped. The Mustang was trying to speak. Michael rushed back to its side, kneeling down beside the animal. "Hey, you're gonna be all right," he whispered, more to reassure himself than the horse. The Mustang's eyes flickered open, its gaze locked on Michael. There was a raw desperation in those eyes, a plea that Michael couldn't ignore. The storm outside continued its rage, but inside the cabin, it felt like time had stopped. Michael stayed by the Mustang's side, holding its head gently, giving it whatever comfort he could. It was a strange feeling, this responsibility he had taken on. In a way, he felt like he was connected to the horse now. It wasn't just a wild animal anymore. It was something more, something that needed him as much as he needed it. Michael thought back to his life before the ranch, before everything had changed. He had grown up surrounded by animals, always with a love for horses. But life had pulled him into a more solitary existence, away from the freedom and companionship of his youth. In a way, this horse reminded him of the life he had once dreamed of, a life of freedom and strength. He glanced out the window at the swirling snow, his mind racing with thoughts of what the future might hold. He couldn't stay here forever. He had to get back to the ranch, to his family, to his life. But how could he leave this animal? How could he leave something that had made its last plea for help? Suddenly, the Mustang shifted, its body trembling as it struggled to rise. Michael's heart surged with hope. "Easy, buddy," he whispered, his hands quickly reaching to steady the animal. The Mustang's legs wobbled, and for a moment, Michael feared it would fall again. But the horse managed to stand, albeit shakily. "You're stronger than you look," Michael murmured. The Mustang took a few slow steps, its hooves scraping lightly against the wooden floor. Michael moved to stand beside it, his hand on its shoulder. "We're going to get through this together," he said, the words falling more easily now. He didn't know how, but he would find a way. But just as he began to feel a spark of hope, a loud crack echoed through the room, the unmistakable sound of the roof creaking under the weight of the snowstorm. Michael froze, his eyes widening in alarm. The Mustang's head snapped toward the ceiling, ears flicking nervously. The wind howled, and the storm seemed to intensify with every passing second. Michael's pulse quickened. The cabin wasn't going to hold much longer. He needed to get the Mustang back out into the storm. The storm outside was fierce, but the cabin, even though it offered temporary shelter, wasn't going to be enough. He grabbed the rope again, looping it carefully around the horse's chest, his fingers trembling in the cold. "Come on, we're not giving up now," Michael muttered. The Mustang, though weak, gave a low whinny, as if understanding the urgency. Together they moved toward the door, the blizzard outside waiting for them. But as they stepped out into the snow, Michael realized the real challenge had just begun. The storm was fiercer than ever, and he was about to face a test like no other. And the Mustang, still shaking, was depending on him to survive. The wind howled like a living creature, whipping the snow into blinding torrents that cut through Michael's clothes and froze his breath midair. The Mustang stumbled beside him, its legs unsteady in the thick snow. But there was a fire in its eyes that refused to be extinguished. Michael's heart raced in time with the pounding of his own hooves, each step carrying them deeper into the storm. The cabin had been their brief sanctuary, but it couldn't protect them for long. The blizzard was relentless. The storm had moved in faster than he anticipated, and now he was trapped out in the wilderness with the injured Mustang, nowhere near shelter and only his instincts to guide him. "You're doing good," Michael muttered through gritted teeth, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. "Just keep going. We're getting to higher ground." He knew that if they didn't get to a ridge soon, they'd be lost. The snow was coming down harder now, and he could feel the temperature dropping even more. His breath clouded in front of him, each inhalation stinging as if his lungs themselves were freezing. The Mustang staggered beside him, its head down and its breath shallow. Every time the horse's legs gave way, Michael's heart skipped a beat. He reached out, grabbing the rope that tied them together, and gently tugged it, urging the horse to take a few more steps. "Come on, you've got this," Michael said, his voice cracking with the cold. He wasn't sure if the words were meant for the Mustang or for himself. He had never been in a storm this bad before. He had never felt so exposed. As they trudged forward, Michael's mind raced with thoughts of his sister back at the ranch. He'd promised her he'd be back before dark. That was hours ago. He should have known the storm was coming. He should have prepared better. But now it was just him and the Mustang, and he had to get them through this. There was no other choice. The snow continued to fall in sheets, covering the ground with each gust of wind. Visibility was down to mere feet, and Michael couldn't see anything beyond the blur of white in front of him. He gripped the rope tighter, hoping the Mustang was still behind him. A soft whinny broke through the howling wind, and Michael stopped dead in his tracks. His heart leaped in his chest. He turned around quickly, his breath catching in his throat. The Mustang was no longer following him. "Hey!" Michael called, his voice desperate. "Where are you going?" The wind carried the sound of the horse's hooves, but there was no response. Michael pushed forward through the snow, his boots sinking deeper into the frozen ground. He could barely see anything in the storm, but the sound of the Mustang's movement was unmistakable. He pulled harder on the rope, hoping to draw the animal back to him, but it wasn't working. Michael's mind raced with fear. He had to get the horse back before it wandered too far, before the storm swallowed them both. The snow was thickening, and the blizzard seemed to be moving faster. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled forward, his legs growing heavier with every step. He couldn't lose the Mustang. Not now. Suddenly, the rope jerked hard in his hands, nearly pulling him off his feet. The Mustang was pulling away, fighting against the pull. Panic surged through Michael's chest, but he refused to let go. "Stop!" Michael shouted, his voice ragged. He gritted his teeth and yanked the rope, forcing the Mustang to come back toward him. The horse whinnied loudly, and for a moment, Michael thought he heard something else in the sound, something like pain. His stomach churned. The Mustang was exhausted, and the storm had drained every ounce of strength from it. "Please, just stay with me," Michael whispered, feeling helpless. The wind howled, biting into his face, and the snow began to fall heavier, nearly blinding him. He could feel the cold sinking deep into his bones, but there was no time to stop. The Mustang stopped struggling against the rope, and Michael pulled it toward him, desperate to keep the animal on its feet. They were running out of time, and Michael knew that if they didn't find shelter soon, neither of them would survive the storm. With a final effort, the Mustang's hooves broke through the snow, and it collapsed to its knees in exhaustion. Michael rushed to its side, his hands trembling as he tried to help the horse back on its feet. He felt his heart skip a beat when the Mustang's eyes met his, raw and pleading. There was a silent understanding between them now. The storm was fierce, and Michael could feel the strength slipping away from him. He had to act fast. Michael wiped the snow from his face and looked around desperately. Just beyond them, a small rock outcropping rose from the ground, just enough to provide a bit of shelter from the storm. "That's our chance," Michael said, more to himself than the Mustang. He grabbed the rope and, with every ounce of strength left in his body, guided the horse toward the rock shelter. The snow was up to their knees, but every step felt like an eternity. Finally, they reached the outcropping. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They were out of the wind, sheltered from the worst of the storm. Michael collapsed next to the Mustang, his body shaking with exhaustion. "We made it," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. The Mustang, still trembling, lowered its head. Michael rested his hand on its neck, feeling the warmth of its body in contrast to the bitter cold that surrounded them. They were both battered, both on the brink of collapse, but in that moment they were alive and together. The storm's fury had not relented, and Michael's muscles were stiff from hours of fighting against the snow. The small rock outcropping offered little comfort, but it was enough to keep them out of the worst of the wind. Still, the cold gnawed at his bones, and he could feel the warmth of his body slowly draining away as the hours ticked by. The Mustang was still beside him, shivering uncontrollably, its coat matted with snow and sweat. It had been silent for what felt like an eternity, its shallow breaths the only sound in the vast, frozen wasteland. Michael had tried everything, wrapping the horse in blankets, rubbing its legs to get the blood flowing, but nothing seemed to work. The Mustang's strength was failing faster than Michael had expected, and the harsh reality was setting in. He couldn't let the horse die. Not here. Not like this. Michael glanced out at the storm, his eyes narrowing. There was no sign of it letting up. The wind had picked up even more, and the snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets that blurred everything beyond 10 feet. He couldn't even see the path they'd taken to get here. His mind raced as he looked down at the Mustang. The horse's eyes, once full of fire, now seemed dull with exhaustion. It was clear that it couldn't go any further, and Michael knew it wouldn't survive the storm if they stayed here much longer. But he couldn't carry it. There was no way. He clenched his fists. He couldn't just leave the horse to die in the storm. That wasn't who he was, but there were no easy answers. Michael thought of the ranch, of his sister, alone, waiting for him to come back. If he didn't make it back soon, they would both be in serious trouble. The ranch was barely holding on as it was, and he couldn't afford to be lost out here forever. He stood up slowly, his legs aching from the cold, and looked at the Mustang one last time. The animal's eyes followed him, a pleading look in them. It was as if the Mustang knew that Michael was about to make the hardest choice of his life. "Stay here," Michael whispered, more to himself than the horse. "I'll go get help." He turned toward the direction he thought the ranch was, trying to steady his breath despite the cold. He had no choice. He had to leave the Mustang, at least for a little while, and get back to the ranch. Maybe he could find someone to help, someone who could get back to the Mustang before it was too late. But as he took a few steps, the wind howling behind him, something inside him twisted. The look in the Mustang's eyes had shaken him to his core. It was an animal that had survived the wild for years, strong and independent, and yet now it was dependent on him, on Michael. And he couldn't bring himself to walk away. But was he walking away? Or was he just trying to get help, to bring someone back who could save them both? He stopped, his boots frozen to the ground as the thought sank in. He couldn't just leave it, not now, not after everything they'd been through together. The snow seemed to swirl even more violently, as if the storm itself was urging him forward, testing his resolve. His breath came in short gasps, and the weight of the situation hung heavy on his chest. If he left, the Mustang might not make it. If he stayed, they both could die. Michael looked back at the Mustang, whose eyes were now following him, a quiet trust in them that made his heart ache. "I'm not leaving you," he said firmly, his voice barely audible in the wind. "We're in this together." With that, Michael took a deep breath and made a decision. He couldn't risk leaving the Mustang behind, but he also couldn't stay in the rock shelter, freezing and alone with no way to get help. There was only one choice left. Michael's hands trembled as he untied the rope from the Mustang's chest, carefully guiding the horse to its feet. The Mustang wobbled, its legs giving out once again, but Michael was there holding it up, refusing to let it fall. The horse seemed to gather itself for a moment before pushing forward, determined to keep moving despite its exhaustion. Michael's heart swelled with pride. This horse, this wild Mustang, had survived against the odds, and now it was looking to him for the strength to survive one more challenge. He tied the rope back around the Mustang's chest, taking a deep breath as he made sure the animal was steady enough to walk. "We're not giving up," Michael said softly. He wasn't sure if it was for the horse's benefit or his own. The wind still howled around them, but Michael could feel the determination surging through him. He couldn't let the storm stop them. Not now. Together they stepped out of the small shelter and into the snowstorm once more. The wind tore at their faces, but neither of them wavered. Each step was harder than the last, but they kept moving forward. Michael's body screamed for rest, but he kept going. The Mustang's legs were shaky, but it kept moving. In the distance, he thought he saw something. A faint shadow through the snow, a silhouette he couldn't quite make out. His heart skipped a beat. Was it a tree, a rock formation, or something else? "Keep going," Michael urged, his voice rough. He wasn't sure how much farther they could go, but as long as the Mustang was with him, he couldn't stop. Not yet. The storm showed no mercy. The blizzard had worsened overnight, and the snowfall piled up deeper than ever before. It felt like the world had been swallowed by white with no end in sight. Every step Michael and the Mustang took felt like they were fighting an invisible force, the wind tearing at them with cold fingers, stinging their skin and numbing their bones. They hadn't made much progress. The Mustang was slowing down, its legs trembling, its coat coated in a thick layer of snow. Michael was exhausted too, barely able to keep his eyes open as he trudged through the knee-deep snow. But he couldn't stop, not yet. Every now and then, he glanced back at the Mustang, its breath heavy and labored. There was a deep, unsettling feeling growing in his chest. He knew the horse was struggling to stay on its feet, but Michael had to keep moving. He had to get them out of this. The ridge was just ahead, or so he hoped. His mind was cloudy from exhaustion, but he remembered it from before. The ridge had been their goal. If they could get there, they'd be able to see the cabin. He was sure of it. "Just a little longer," Michael whispered to the Mustang, his voice hoarse with cold and fatigue. "We're almost there. You can make it." But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. The storm was relentless and the visibility was almost zero. They could be walking in circles for all he knew. The Mustang faltered beside him, and this time Michael couldn't catch it in time. The horse collapsed into the snow with a strained whinny, its legs giving way beneath it. Michael's heart stopped. He dropped to his knees in the snow beside the horse, his breath shallow as he tried to catch his bearings. "No, no, no," Michael muttered, feeling the cold biting deeper as panic crept into his voice. His hands shook as he tried to lift the Mustang back onto its feet, but the horse's body was limp, its eyes closed in exhaustion. It was then that he realized how close they were to the edge of the ridge. If they didn't get to higher ground, they might not make it at all. The snow was piling up faster, and the storm showed no signs of relenting. Michael pressed his face against the Mustang's mane, his own tears freezing in the air. He was losing the fight. The horse wasn't going to make it through this. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. He didn't know if the horse could hear him, but it didn't matter anymore. He had failed. His promise to his sister, his promise to the Mustang, it all seemed so meaningless now. They weren't going to survive this. But then, just as Michael thought he couldn't go on, something unexpected happened. The Mustang stirred beneath him, a soft, trembling movement that barely registered at first. Then the horse's head lifted slightly, its eyes slowly opening, locked onto Michael with a quiet intensity. For a moment, Michael just stared at the Mustang, heart hammering in his chest. Was it possible? Was the horse really going to get up? The Mustang's legs quivered beneath it, but then, with a deep, pained breath, it pushed itself upright. Michael gasped, barely able to believe his eyes. It was happening. The horse was still fighting. It was still alive. Michael scrambled to his feet, his hands trembling as he guided the horse back onto its legs. The Mustang swayed but didn't fall. "Come on," Michael urged, his voice hoarse but steady now. "We're not giving up. You're not giving up." The Mustang seemed to hear him. It shifted its weight, taking hesitant steps forward. Each one slow and careful, but it moved. Together they took one step after another, inching closer to the ridge. The storm raged on, but the bond between them was unbreakable. They were both at their breaking point, but neither of them was ready to give in. The storm howled louder than ever as they climbed higher, their bodies screaming in protest. The snow seemed to grow deeper with every step, but Michael could see the ridge now, just within reach. It wasn't much, just a small rise in the land, but it was all they needed. From there, they would be able to see the cabin. The Mustang's movements were sluggish, but with each step, Michael's hope grew stronger. They were getting closer. But then as they crested the ridge, something hit Michael like a punch to the stomach. The sight that met his eyes was nothing like he had expected. A figure stood at the top of the ridge, barely visible through the snowstorm. For a moment, Michael thought his mind was playing tricks on him, but then the figure waved and Michael's heart skipped a beat. It was a person, a rescuer maybe, someone who had come looking for them. "Hey," Michael shouted, his voice barely carrying over the storm. "Over here, we need help." The figure didn't respond, but they turned and started moving toward Michael. His heart raced with both fear and hope. Maybe they weren't alone. Maybe there was a chance after all. But as the figure drew closer, something shifted in Michael's chest. The shape wasn't quite right, and the way they moved wasn't familiar. It was too slow, too hesitant, like they were struggling with the same exhaustion that Michael was. Michael squinted, trying to make out more details, and then it hit him. This wasn't a rescuer. This was someone who was in as much trouble as they were. It was another lost soul, another survivor of the storm, someone who had been fighting the same battle against nature. The Mustang let out a low whinny, and Michael turned to see it looking at him with the same sense of urgency he had felt only moments before. The horse's eyes were wide with fear, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Michael realized that he wasn't alone in this battle against the storm. They were all fighting for survival now. The figure on the ridge was now close enough that Michael could see the details of their clothing, the heavy layers meant to protect against the storm. But the closer they got, the more Michael's sense of dread grew. They weren't running toward him with urgency. They were moving slowly, almost deliberately, and there was something off about their posture, something that screamed exhaustion and defeat. Michael took a hesitant step forward, the snow beneath his boots cracking with the weight of his movement. The Mustang followed suit, its legs unsteady but determined. Michael barely noticed the cold anymore, his mind consumed by the figure ahead. As the figure drew even closer, he saw the way they staggered, like someone who could barely hold themselves upright. For a second, his heart leapt with hope. Maybe this person knew something. Maybe they were prepared for the storm. But that hope vanished when the figure collapsed into the snow with a soft, helpless cry. "Hey!" Michael rushed toward them, his feet slipping on the icy ground. "Are you all right?" The figure groaned, pushing themselves up weakly. The storm was relentless, the wind cutting through everything. And for a moment, Michael wasn't sure if the person had even heard him. Then, through the howling wind, the figure's voice came, ragged and faint. "It's too late." Michael's heart clenched, and he knelt beside the person brushing the snow from their face. It was a man, younger than Michael, with a face that looked far too pale. He had the gaunt look of someone who had been lost in the storm for much longer than Michael had. Where are you from?" Michael asked, his voice tight with both concern and frustration. This wasn't supposed to be happening. They were supposed to be helping each other, not succumbing to the storm. The man's eyes flickered, struggling to focus. I was heading back to the ranch, the snow. I couldn't make it, too far. Michael felt a wave of panic rise within him. The man had come from the same direction they were heading. If he had failed, if he hadn't made it back, what hope did Michael have? "We're not far from the ridge," Michael said, forcing a calmness into his voice that he didn't feel. "We can make it, you and me. We'll get through this." The Mustang shifted nervously beside him, sensing the rising tension. The horse snorted, stamping its feet in the snow. Michael glanced at it, then back at the man. "I'll help you," Michael said, his voice firm. "I won't leave you here." The man shook his head weakly. "It's too much." But Michael refused to listen. His mind was made up. The Mustang had fought through everything, and now so would he. The storm might be trying to break him, but he wasn't going to let it take anyone else. Not this time. "I'm not leaving you," Michael repeated more forcefully. He took a step forward, offering the man his arm. "We're in this together." The man hesitated, his gaze drifting to the Mustang, who stood unwavering beside Michael, as if to affirm his words. The Mustang seemed to sense the urgency, its breath coming out in thick puffs, its body trembling from exhaustion, but still standing tall. Slowly, the man reached out, his hands shaky but strong enough to grasp Michael's arm. "All right," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. "All right, let's go." Together they began moving forward, the snow stinging their faces as the wind whipped mercilessly around them. Michael wasn't sure if the man could even make it to the ridge. He wasn't sure if either of them could, but he was determined to try. The Mustang was a steady presence beside him, its steps slow but purposeful. They moved as a unit now, three souls fighting against the elements. There was no time for doubt, no room for hesitation. But then, as they pushed through the snow, the wind suddenly died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The storm seemed to pause for just a moment, a brief lull in the chaos that had gripped them for what felt like forever. Michael looked up, his breath caught in his throat. Through the clearing snow, he could see something, a faint outline in the distance, a silhouette, the shape of a building, the cabin. "We're almost there," Michael whispered to the man, his voice barely audible in the stillness. But just as he said it, the storm picked up again, stronger than before. The wind tore through them with a renewed fury, and the snow once again blurred everything in front of them. The man beside him stumbled, his feet slipping out from under him as his strength failed. Michael reached out, catching him just in time before he hit the ground. "You can't give up now," Michael urged, his voice raw. "We're so close. You're not going to die out here. We're almost there." But the man only shook his head, a weak, defeated laugh escaping his lips. "It's too late for me," he said, his voice full of resignation. "You need to go. You need to make it." The words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He wasn't ready to let go of this man, not yet. But as he looked at the Mustang, its steady, unwavering presence beside them, Michael knew what he had to do. He couldn't carry this man any further. He couldn't let the storm break them both. "We'll make it together," Michael said, his voice trembling with resolve. He helped the man back to his feet and pushed forward. "We're almost there." And this time, with every step they took, Michael felt the pull of hope. It wasn't just the cabin in the distance. It was something deeper, a belief that, no matter what the storm had taken from them, they could still make it, together. The storm was relentless, the wind howling with fury, yet somehow the cabin ahead seemed to grow clearer with each agonizing step. Every part of Michael's body screamed for rest, for relief from the cold that gnawed at him. But he refused to stop. Not now. The man, though weak and barely able to keep up, was still with him. And the Mustang, its body shuddering from exhaustion, but still pressing forward beside them. The horse had become more than just a companion. It had become a symbol of everything they'd fought through together. Resilience, hope, survival. With every step closer to the cabin, Michael's heart grew heavier with the weight of the choice that was coming. The man beside him was still fading, his steps slower, his breaths shallow. Michael could feel the man's weight against him, and he knew that if they didn't make it to shelter soon, they might lose him. The storm had taken too much already, but they were so close. The cabin was no longer a shadow. It was a tangible reality, and Michael could see the soft glow of light peeking from the windows, a promise of warmth and safety just within reach. "Stay with me," Michael whispered, his voice hoarse as he tightened his grip on the man's arm. He was growing desperate now, his thoughts turning into frantic pleas, but he couldn't show it. Not yet, not when they were so close. The Mustang snorted as if urging them forward. With one final strained push, they reached the door of the cabin. Michael was so out of breath that he couldn't even knock. He just pushed the door open with all the strength he had left. The warmth inside hit him like a wall, and for a moment he just stood there blinking, trying to adjust to the sudden shift from biting cold to a soft, enveloping warmth. But there was no time to savor the relief. The man beside him was slumped, his legs giving way beneath him as Michael gently guided him towards a chair. "Help him!" Michael called out, his voice shaking with fear and exhaustion. Inside the cabin, an older woman rushed to the man's side. She looked like someone who had seen a lot in her years, her face weathered by time and experience. But the look in her eyes as she glanced at Michael was full of recognition. She had seen people come in from the storm before, people who had been through this exact battle. She went to work immediately, checking the man's pulse and murmuring words of comfort as she wrapped him in blankets and tried to warm his frozen body. Michael stepped back, watching the scene unfold. His heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to help, but all he could do was stand there, helpless, as the older woman worked quickly and efficiently. Then he turned his attention to the Mustang, still standing in the doorway. The horse was shivering violently, its chest heaving as it stood there, exhausted and on the brink of collapse. "I'm so sorry," Michael whispered to the Mustang, feeling his chest tighten. He stepped over to the horse, his hands trembling as he patted its freezing coat. "We're here now. You made it." But the Mustang, as if understanding, nuzzled him gently. Its breath was ragged, its eyes full of fatigue. But there was something deeper in those eyes, something that told Michael this journey had meant something more than just survival. The older woman finished checking the man's vitals and looked up at Michael. "He's alive, but he's in bad shape," she said softly. "We'll need to keep him warm and monitor him." Michael exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He turned back to the Mustang. "Now we just need to take care of you too." The woman gave him a soft smile. "We'll get the horse inside too. There's a stable out back, but we need to bring him in carefully. He's as much a survivor as you are." Michael nodded, his body feeling as though it had been drained of all energy. But as he looked back at the Mustang, he realized something. They had both made it. Against all odds, they had survived the storm. The storm had tried to take everything from them, but in the end, it had only strengthened their bond. It had tested their courage, their resilience, and their will to fight. But it hadn't broken them. The older woman helped Michael guide the Mustang toward the stable. And as he led the horse inside, he turned back to see the man, now wrapped in blankets, his breathing steady, but still shallow. It wasn't over. Not yet, but the hardest part was behind them. As the door of the stable closed, Michael rested his head against the Mustang's side, feeling the warmth of the horse's body against his. They had made it. Against all odds, they had found their way home. And in that moment, as the storm raged on outside, Michael knew one thing for sure. They were stronger than the storm, and they would always be. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any inspiring and miraculous stories. Our channel is dedicated to bringing you deep emotional stories about the power of love and resilience in life. Share this story with your friends and family so we can spread positive messages together. Make sure to turn on notifications so you can stay updated with our latest uploads and continue joining us on a journey to explore more heartwarming and inspiring stories. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.